Okay, hello, we're back again. I was just noting with some of the people who are here with me in the live version of this course that we're about 2/3 of the way through. So we're just steaming ahead, making some real progress. So this evening, we're going to be talking a little bit more about the 19th century, and then we're going to be moving into the 20th century. And after this, we're going to be moving into a series of classes devoted specifically to modernism and the emergence of modernism. But first of all, let me ask if there are any questions. Any questions, problems? Okay. All right. Well, good. We're doing well then. All right. You will recall at the end of last class, we had begun to talk about Gerard Manley Hopkins. And while Hopkins is or was a 19th century poet and was very much a person of his time, he also is writing a kind of experimental poetry which is going to be looking forward to the emergence of modern poetry in its most modernist and experimentalist forms. And so much so that in his own time, people didn't really know what to do with Hopkins. And he was largely ignored. Very few people ever read his poetry. It never got any real circulation, and it didn't get any positive kinds of literary reviews. And so only a few people were even aware of it, most of them his close friends, with whom he shared manuscripts of his poems. But that was going to change, because in 1918 there was actually a publication in a form of edition of his poetry, and then in the 1920s there was an enormous explosion of interest in Hopkins. And we'll come back to that phenomenon when we get into the 1920s, because we'll be able to see more clearly how the conditions for reception had changed. The conditions for reception now have to do with having an audience, right? Just because a writer writes something doesn't mean that there is an audience out there prepared for the kind of work that the writer has written. The same kind of thing happened in America with Herman Melville. Herman Melville had a modest reputation, and then with some of his earlier works, and then he came out with Moby Dick, and nobody knew what to do with Moby Dick. And it certainly didn't fit the kinds of aesthetic criteria of the times or the aesthetic expectations of the reading audience at the time. And so, in effect, the novel really almost went nowhere. And by the time he died, he really had almost been forgotten completely. And then, once again, in the 20th century, his reputation was recovered through his work being rediscovered, because it wasn't until long after he had died that an audience actually developed for his work. And that's an interesting but curious fact about literature, is that sometimes a writer, as we will say, will be so much ahead of her or his time that the person may not have an immediate following, and only later on will develop one. Blake had the same kind of problem. Remember when we talked all the way back at the beginning of the course about William Blake? People in his own time really didn't understand what he was doing. They thought that his poetry might be interesting, but they, didn't really know what to make of it. And towards the end of his life, he did develop some younger, well, I almost said fans, but it's not exactly the same thing as having, a rock star developing fan base. But he developed some people who were appreciating his poetry, who gathered around him and visited with him and so forth. But still, we're not talking about a very large group. And it was only gradually that his reputation developed and then increased. Hopkins had the same kind of fate. Quite unlike other Victorian poets whom we have been looking at. Tennyson was enormously popular in his time. So was Browning. Browning was enormously popular, not for all of his poems, but for many of his poems, which reached a wide popular audience. And of course, as you know, his wife was a poet as well. We haven't been able to deal with her poetry directly, but she's a very interesting poet in her own right, and you may want to go out, those of you who are interested in working on the woman question, and look at some of her poetry along with the poetry of other Victorian women poets. So, and by the way, we've got fair representations of these in our anthology. But back to Hopkins. Let's take a look once again. If we can go to the screen, please. Let's take a look once again where he is coming from. And you'll remember at the end of last class, I'd been talking about a theme that we've been developing over several classes. And that was how in the 18th, but particularly in the 19th century, and then on into the 20th century, there developed among many people, certainly not all, but among many people, what I've been calling a crisis of faith. A crisis of faith. And we've been talking about the complexity of that, the different kinds of responses to that. In Hopkins' case, he got caught up in a particular movement which came to be known as the Oxford movement. And the Oxford movement, he wasn't in the first generation of the Oxford movement, he came into the second generation of that. But let me just say a few words about the Oxford movement. Oxford in the 19th century was producing more people who were majoring in theology or related disciplines, preparing for the clergy than anything else. I mean, we usually think of a university as producing people who are history majors and English majors and chemistry and so on and so on and so on. Well, Oxford is that way now, of course. But in the 19th century, a very large percentage of the students were actually students of religion. And as I said, were preparing for some kind of position as ministers. And the university was at that time dominated to a very large extent by a group of Anglican clergy led by Pusey and Newman, whose names I had up here just a second ago, Pusey and Newman. And what they were doing was they were trying to figure out on historical grounds what was the legitimacy of their church. Now we're talking about the Anglican Church or the Church of England, what over here is usually called the Episcopal Church. And as they began to develop their researches into the history of the Church of England in particular, and trying to establish its legitimacy, the question came up about apostolic succession. Now, the Catholic Church has always argued that the current Pope and bishops go back in an unbroken line to the time of Jesus. And this is what is meant by apostolic succession. And so the Catholic Church has always argued that its authority derives from its apostolic succession. Well, the Church of England has also often made that kind of argument and said that after the break with Rome, that there wasn't really a break in that kind of succession of the bishops. And that's, at any rate, a little bit more technical than I meant to get right now. But in any event, this was the sort of thing that people were thinking about, and there was a lot of discussion of religion and of the different religions and how they were responding to the different kinds of crises that we've been talking about here, particularly those that were being raised by the new sciences and so forth. Okay, so there was again and again and again in different religious communities, therefore, a search for legitimacy and to pin down what was the authority of the church, and of course, therefore, of its clergy, and especially of its leadership. Well, Newman eventually argued himself into converting to Roman Catholicism. So he left the Church of England and became a Roman Catholic. And as many of you know, in colleges and universities around the United States, at any rate, there will often be a Newman Center, which is actually the center for Catholic students, and they'll usually have a chapel there and a chaplain and whatnot. And so that's simply carrying on his name because he began a whole movement in which people began to rethink Roman Catholicism. Now, there had been, from the 16th and 17th centuries on, a lot of antagonism in England towards Roman Catholics, and particularly, not so much as individuals, but particularly Roman Catholicism. And some of you who have taken the earlier half of this course with me will have gone through this with Alexander Pope, for example, who was a Roman Catholic, and how he had to deal, and his community had to deal with some of this antagonism. Well, in the 18th and 19th centuries, up until the 1830s, by the way, Catholics could not hold office. They could not own property beyond certain limits in their own names. There were all sorts of restrictions on their rights as citizens, even, until the Catholic Emancipation Act in the 1830s, which guaranteed to Roman Catholics the same kinds of rights of citizenship as anybody else in England, and of course guaranteed their religious freedom. So, the point I'm getting at, though, is that there was a certain kind of residual antagonism towards Catholicism still in England in the 19th century, and what Newman and others were doing was actually beginning to turn this around. But it's more complicated than just that. One of the things that we've been talking about here is how there was a reevaluation, as we saw in Ruskin, but this is also true elsewhere among writers and intellectuals and artists in the 19th century. But we saw this in Ruskin, a reevaluation of the Middle Ages. During the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, there had been a tendency to put down the Middle Ages. First of all, as I've mentioned here before, with the term Middle Ages. I mean, after all, what does that mean if it isn't a derogatory category to begin with? Even worse, the Dark Ages. And there were all of these cliches, not simply about people wandering around with these strange beliefs and mythologies and so forth, but also this was taken over by some, not all, but by some of the Protestant reformers who were saying, yes, 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 and of course it was the church that was, which of course would have been the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, it was the church that was primarily responsible for the kinds of ridiculous myths that people believed in, and the church was authoritarian and forced people into belief, and so on and so on and so on. Okay, but in the 19th century, there were people who were beginning to rethink that and to say, wait a minute now, the Middle Ages may actually have gotten a bad reputation, that there are a lot of very good and very positive things that happened in the Middle Ages. And some, like Ruskin, even went so far, as we saw in our last class, as to argue that the Middle Ages really were our lost golden age. Remember his analysis of the Gothic, and particularly of Gothic architecture as seen in the great cathedrals of the Middle Ages, and how the very imperfections often in those works of art were themselves prima facie evidence of the freedom that individuals were given in that culture to express themselves. In other words, that this really was a very important point in our culture in which a true value on the human and on the individual was really encouraged, as seen in the evidence of the cathedrals. So, in any event, I don't want just to repeat that argument, just to call it once again to mind. So that was one thing that was going on. And by the way, that actually transformed church architecture. Look at churches. I'm talking about Protestant churches now, not Catholic churches, that were built in the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, particularly in the United States as well as in England and elsewhere. And what do you see? Very, very frequently, they are designed to look like the Gothic cathedrals in many respects. I mean, think of the churches here in Houston. I'm talking about Protestant churches now that were built towards the end of the 19th century or the early part of the 20th century, that if you didn't know the difference, you might think that that was a Catholic church, right? Just looking at the exterior, or sometimes even going inside the church and looking at the way the church was planned and designed. That is in large part due to the influence of John Ruskin. And that usually is referred to in art history and art history textbooks as a Gothic revival or a kind of neo-Gothicism, okay, or simply a Gothic revival. Well, notice that that's all bringing about medieval culture and possibly even the religious traditions of the Middle Ages into a new light, a new, potentially at least more favorable light. At the same time, the Catholic Church in the First Vatican Council of 1871 was endorsing this view, and the Pope at the time, Pope Leo XIII, wrote an encyclical, which is an official papal letter, called Aeterni Patris, in which he was saying that the only way to deal with the skepticism of the modern world was to return to the golden age of Catholic philosophy and theology, especially in the 13th century, and especially that of St. Thomas Aquinas. And so he called for a reform of the whole educational system in Catholic schools, Catholic seminaries, Catholic colleges and universities, in which they would promote the scholarship dealing with and then the teaching of the philosophy and theology of Thomas Aquinas. And so, for example, here in Houston, we have a Catholic college, which is called the University of St. Thomas, but they're all over the place, St. Thomas high schools and colleges and seminaries and so forth, and not just in North America, but all over the place where there are institutions of Catholic learning. Okay, so notice that a number of things are beginning to converge, which at least open up the possibility of people in England and elsewhere taking a more positive view of Catholicism. Newman, then, who was one of the great leaders of the Protestant Church of England, converted to Catholicism, and people are scratching their heads saying, what happened? What happened? I mean, if Newman could convert to Catholicism, maybe there's something to it. And so Newman wrote a very famous book called his Apologia Pro Vita Sua. Apologia Pro Vita Sua. We often use that now as a phrase when somebody is making a defense of what he's done or she has done in the person's life and career. We often say, oh, that's the person's Apologia Pro Vita Sua. By the way, the old meaning of the Greek word apologia, which came into Latin as apologia, really didn't mean apology in our sense of apology. You know, like I apologize for making a mistake or maybe hurting your feelings or something like that. The word originally meant a defense, a reasoned defense, such as a lawyer might make in a court proceeding. Okay, so That's what Newman did, and it's a very long book in which he goes through all of the intricacies of his arguments with himself as well as with others in eventually coming round to converting to Catholicism. Okay, so others began to take another look, and there was actually a lot of interest in the subject, and numbers of people, especially young students, converted to Catholicism, and many artists converted to Catholicism. And as I was saying at the end of our last class, it's sometimes one of the jokes that people get into about this period, at least dealing with the phenomenon that we're discussing right now, that, if your son or daughter came home from the university and said, well, Mom and Dad, I've been taking this course and that course and so forth, and I've decided that I'm an atheist. And people would say, yeah, okay, well, you're young, you're a college student right now, you'll come around later on. But when young son or daughter came home and said, Mom, Dad, I've decided to become a Catholic, it was, oh my God, what have we done wrong? How have we failed you? Despite the fact that people were really very, very much surprised when a census taken in the middle of the 19th century in England indicated that the population, the Catholic population in England, numbered around 20%. Nobody had the vaguest idea that there were that many Catholics around. Okay, so what happened then was not only in the first generation of the Oxford movement, but then in the second and third and fourth generations of the Oxford movement, there were people who went back, not everybody by any means, but there were some notable individuals who went back, took another look at Catholicism, and converted. Hopkins was one of these. He not only converted, but he also became a priest, even became a Jesuit priest, and he taught in one of their colleges. He was a literature teacher, by the way, and he taught, guess what, medieval literature, right? Because the interest in things medieval had been revived, and that extended to the literature as well as to the art and the philosophy and so forth, the music and so on. There was a great movement in the 19th century to recover the structures and the modes of singing medieval music. Not only religious music, such as Gregorian chant, and there was, at the monastery in France of Salem, generations of Benedictine monks worked on as scholars in recovering the systems of the chant in the Middle Ages. And it's beautiful, beautiful music, but also secular music as well. Secular poetry, secular music, and so on. Okay, so here's Hopkins, now teaching medieval literature. Well, some of the patterns in medieval literature he's taking over and using experimentally in his own poetry. One of the things that is done in Old English poetry, and if you haven't read any of Old English in the original, or you haven't heard me read Old English in the original, I haven't been so fortunate yet. Let me just say that one of the characteristics of Old English poetry, I'm talking about the poetry of the Anglo-Saxons, is that it uses the device of alliteration to a very large degree, so that very frequently within the same line you will have two words or sometimes three words alliterating. Now, what alliteration means is that the first letter or sound of the word will be repeated in other words. So if you have, for example, the bold, brave boys, the b repetitions at the beginnings of those words, that's alliteration. And, of course, here is Hopkins taking this over and experimenting with it in his poetry. There was, in Chaucer's time, and Chaucer didn't do this himself, actually Chaucer made fun of it, but in Chaucer's time, in the 14th century, when the language had changed from Old English to Middle English, there was what was called an alliterative revival, in which the same kinds of patterns that had been used in Old English poetry were now being revived and used in Middle English poetry towards the end of the Middle Ages. This is just before the language changed again into early modern English, which is the language, say, of the King James Bible and of Shakespeare, which is not quite our modern English, is it? But it's modern enough that we understand it. You know, sometimes we have to have some footnote help, but in general we can understand it, whereas most people, when they come to Chaucer for the first time, as a Middle English poet, have difficulty understanding the poet until they've read enough of it over several days and weeks, and then you begin to catch on to it, especially if you have the help of a teacher. With Old English poetry, however, Old English poetry is really a foreign language to us because it's really a branch of German. And if you know any German and you look at some Old English, you can actually see how a lot of that works. Okay, so here's Hopkins now. Let's go back to God's grandeur in our text. And I was just reading this at the end of our last class just to give you a little taste of what we were going to be doing in the beginning of today's class. But notice how what he's doing here is totally different from anything that we've seen in the poets we've been reading so far. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. By the way, this is a sonnet. It's an unconventional sonnet, but it's a sonnet, right? You see how this is a sonnet? What would give you an idea that this is a sonnet? Anybody have some notion? Yeah, I see you're counting lines. That's right. That's right. A sonnet is a 14-line poem. The sonnet was taken over into English from the Italian. The great sonnet writer in Italian, of course, was Petrarch. And Petrarch had an enormous influence in England in the 16th century, and many of the finest poets in English of the 16th and early 17th centuries wrote sonnets. Sidney, Spenser, Shakespeare, John Donne, and so forth. Okay, so first of all, this is a 14-line poem. And notice how, first of all, we have 8 lines. It's called an octet, followed by a 6-line section called a sestet, for 6, a group of 6. And then let's look here. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. Now, already we've got 2 G's alliterating, don't we? Grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. Okay? We've got the alliterating F's. And within the alliterating F pattern, we have the alliterating SH sounds. And I'm not going to go through every one of them, but you can see that for yourself as you look through the poem. Okay, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. That's easy enough for us to grasp, isn't it? Certainly that's the same kind of thing that Wordsworth was talking about in Tintern Abbey and in the Prelude and in his other poetry, for that matter. But just to take some of the work that we looked at in great detail here in class, that the world is charged with the grandeur of God. It the grandeur of God, will flame out, okay, which is a nice metaphor to begin with, but then look at the simile that follows that, like shining from shook foil. Have you ever shaken some foil? Okay, and how it flashes and ripples in the light? It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil, like the ooze of oil. Notice the similes that he's using here. These are very daring and unusual similes for talking about the grandeur of God. Notice he's not using the conventional ways of describing God or God's grandeur, but God's grandeur is like shining from shook foil, or like the ooze of oil crushed. And notice how in reading that you're forced to go over to the next line. You can't just end with like the ooze of oil. You're forced to go over to like the ooze of oil crushed. Okay? And that, too, is one of the poetic devices that he will often be experimenting with. Why do men then now not wreck his rod? Well, okay, wreck is an older word that survives only in the word reckon. Okay, not wreck in the sense of break something up, but wreck in the sense of reckon, or understand, or believe. His rod not only being the rod of authority, but there's a pun here because the older meaning of this term was also associated with rood, R-O-O-D, and rood is an older word for cross, as in Christ's cross. In a lot of older churches in England, but also elsewhere, but I'm just talking about English churches now, there will be something called a rood screen. And there's a part of the church which actually has the rood, as it's still called. Okay? Generations, okay, see, now then, if the grandeur of God is all over the place, then why aren't people paying attention to God? Now, in our time, in our lifetime. Generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge, and shares man's smell. Sounds like the description of Coketown in Dickens' Hard Times, doesn't it? That's exactly what Dickens was saying. All is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. Okay? Look what we have done in the Industrial Revolution. And as I've said already here many times, people in the 19th century often were applauding the great advances that have been made by the Industrial Revolution, but at the same time, there were those who said, but what price have we paid? And that's what Hopkins is raising here, too. The soil is bare now, as in things like strip mining. Have you ever been places where there was strip mining? You know, there are parts of the United States, unfortunately, where that's been done, and it's been done in various parts of Britain as well. For example, in Wales, those absolutely beautiful mountains, some of them in North Wales, some of them are now bare because what's happened is that they've come in and just stripped the side of a mountain. Well, what that means is that there are places where the coal is close to the surface. You don't have to go down in mines very far, but you can actually strip off the layer of dirt. Of course, you have to knock down the trees and clear away the vegetation and so forth. And then you go in and you strip off the layer of earth, and then you've got the coal right underneath there. And it's very easy to get at it, and it's very cheap to mine in that way. And so a lot of that kind of thing has been done. Okay, but the earth now, or the soil, is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. Being shod. Notice that our wearing shoes, even when we're out in the countryside, let's say, or on the seashore, becomes a metaphor for how we have cut ourselves off from the direct contact with nature, and therefore direct experiences with nature. Okay, so that's the movement then in the octave. Now, notice that the octave is broken up into two quatrains. Quatrains are 4-line sections in poetry. 4-line sections. Okay, so you have the first 4 lines talking about the glory of God, but then raising the pertinent question. And then the next 4 lines talking about what we have done to the grandeur of God by smearing the beauty of God's creation. So now we go into the sestet. And for all this, nature is never spent. Okay, notice now there's a shift. Despite everything we do to nature, we've never really completely wrecked it. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things. Notice the alliteration again, by the way. The dearest freshness deep down things. Notice how daring this is in the handling simply of the syntax or the grammar of the sentence. That doesn't read like a regular English sentence, does it? And yet notice what he accomplishes. Okay? And though the last lights off the black west went, O morning at the brown brink eastward springs. See, even though the sun sets on us every day, we can look forward to the dawn. Even though we do everything we can to blear and smear nature, nature somehow or another is always able to come back. Why? Why? Well, that's what we're going to get here in the final 2 lines. Because the Holy Ghost, for Christians the third person in the Trinity, over the bent world broods with warm breast and with bright wings. Okay? And notice the world broods, warm breast, bright wings. Notice just the sound pattern that he has established here. Okay? So notice, in one sense, this is a very conventional idea, isn't it? And you could find lots of religious literature that would deal with exactly the same kind of idea. But one of the things that Hopkins has done, to borrow a phrase from Alexander Pope, is to provide us with what oft was thought but ne'er so well expressed. It's the poetry itself that drives this home in a way that the point might not have been driven home if it were given to us in a simpler kind of prose manner. Okay? Let's look at another one of his poems. Let's look at the Windhover. The Windhover. Okay? As the footnote points out, the Windhover is a kestrel. We have kestrels here, by the way. Some of you have probably seen them in the wintertime. You know, when the migrations take place, as they're taking place, you know, in the fall, and of course in the spring, going in the opposite direction. But in the fall, we have kestrels as well as other falcons and so forth coming down either to our part of the country or through our part of the country. And you can see kestrels, which are amazing, amazing looking birds. And notice this is dedicated to Christ our Lord. And again, though this is a very unusually constructed and composed poem in structure and in style, notice once again that this is a sonnet. All right? And the blank spaces there indicate to you the different sections of the sonnet. I caught this morning morning's minion, kingdom of daylight's dauphin, dappled dawn-drawn falcon, in his riding of the rolling level, underneath him steady air, and striding high there, how he rung upon the rein of a wimpling wing in his ecstasy, then off, forth on swing, as a skate's heel sweeps smooth on a bow bend, the hurl and gliding rebuffed the big wind, my heart in hiding, stirred for a bird, the achieve of, the mastery of the thing. Okay, now that's very unusual, isn't it? Poetically, but also even grammatically, it's very unusual. The way he's putting together the patterns of words here. Brute beauty and valor and act, oh, air, pride, plume here, buckle. And the fire that breaks from thee, then a billion times told lovelier, more dangerous, oh, my chevalier. No wonder of it, sheer plod makes plow down Sicilian shine, and blue bleak embers, ah, my dear, fall, gall themselves, and gash gold vermilion. Well, you know, I mean, we could spend a very great deal of time on this poem, going over it and over it and over it. But let me at least say this, that if you look at the imagery in this poem, what do we have? Everything here bespeaks of a sense of wonder, a sense of wonder. So that first of all, it's the Windhover, which is moving on the air, catching the wind currents, the updrafts and downdrafts of the wind, sweeping around. And the kestrel itself, by the way, is a very dramatic-looking bird. For those of you who have seen kestrels, you know what I'm talking about. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture here. Okay, so we've got that. But we've also got the way in which he's putting things together here. I caught this morning's minion. I caught this morning's minion. Okay, and our editor has put darling in there as a gloss for minion. But minion is more than just darling. It's also, a minion is what else? It's like a servant, yeah. It's like a servant. Okay. Kingdom of daylight's dauphin. Okay. Kingdom of daylight's dauphin. The dauphin in French history, the dauphin was the prince who would succeed to the king of France. And then notice, dappled dawn-drawn falcon. Dapple, what is dapple? We say that something is dappled. Spotted, right. Particularly brown spotted or brown and black spotted or something like that. But dappled, yeah, spotted. Dawn, okay, because we're talking about the dawn, right? Morning's minion and so forth. Kingdom of daylight's dauphin. Drawn perhaps in both senses of the term drawn. Drawn to its flight by the morning light, because now it's time for hawks and other birds to be up and at it, right? but also perhaps drawn in the other sense of to draw, like I could draw a picture, okay? And the colors that he has just described, in effect, are drawing in the sense of providing a picture of and for the bird. Vulcan, in his writing of the rolling level, and then notice there's no punctuation mark here. Underneath him, steady air. That's all just run together. Now, when we get to poets like Yeats and Eliot, we're going to see the same kinds of experiments going on with the structures of the poetry and even the structures of the language. And here I'm talking about grammatical structures of the language. And that's part of what makes reading this kind of poetry difficult. But as we shall discover when we're talking about modernism, modernist poets often prided themselves on being difficult. And they wanted us to work hard at reading and understanding their poems or their pieces of music or their dance or their paintings, their sculpture, their theater, and so forth. They typically don't want to make it easy. And we'll talk about that further when we get to modernism. But you can imagine in the late 19th century that there just weren't very many people around who would be a positive audience for this kind of poetry. I mean, think back on what we saw with Tennyson. I'm not saying that Tennyson isn't a very interesting poet and a very good poet and a very complex poet in lots of ways. But he's complex in different ways. It's usually not difficult for us to figure out just what's being said or what's going on. Okay? Tennyson does not usually disrupt the grammar of the English language. But Hopkins here is disrupting the grammar of the English language in order to create certain poetic effects. Okay? You can go on through this poem. You can read this poem over and over and over and over and over again. I mean, I've been reading this poem for 30 years, and you still find things very, very interesting in it. I had, as a professor who introduced me to Hopkins, by the way, the scholar who was the first person to write a biography of Hopkins and a book-length study of his poetry, a fellow named John Pick. So I was very fortunate in having somebody who not only knew Hopkins very well, but actually loved Hopkins. So, okay. Well, let's begin to move along, and we're now moving into the tail end of the 19th century, and things are going to begin to change, but not all at once, and we're going to see a lot of complexity, even confusion, and certainly ambivalence. Excuse me. Okay, let's go to the screen again, and let's look over at Walter Pater, who certainly is a much more conventional figure of the 19th century in the ways that we have been talking about, but I hope to show you in the next few minutes at any rate that Ruskin is already looking forward in ways that he may not entirely have understood, but he's already beginning to suggest things that are going to be taken up in the 20th century. So first of all, let's talk about his work called The Renaissance, and we have short selections from it. And in particular, let's look first of all at his preface. Now you'll notice that I've put up here on the screen some key terms. Aestheticism. Now, we've talked a little bit here about aesthetics here before, haven't we? Aesthetics developed particularly in the latter part of the 18th century and then in the 19th century as the philosophical inquiry into the nature of art. What makes a work of art, or more generally, what makes art art? And then secondly, if we can agree on some conception of what art is, can we proceed to establish a scheme of values in terms of which we can say that this is good art or not good art, or that some may be a higher form of art than others, or can we not establish that kind of a system of values? Remember, Ruskin was doing that, wasn't he? When Ruskin said that great art is that which conveys the greatest number of the greatest ideas, and then he not only developed that as a theory about art, but he applied that to a Turner painting, actually to a number of Turner paintings, but we looked at one of his descriptions or analyses of a Turner painting in the case of the slave ship. And we saw how Ruskin dealt with things. And we saw how Ruskin was interested not simply in the formal structure or patterning of the work of art, but ultimately, what does the work of art do to us? What does the work of art do to us? And what does the work of art convey to us? If it conveys the greatest number of the greatest ideas, then how does it do that? Well, you can't say in general. You have to look at specific works of art, be they paintings or poems or pieces of music or whatever. Okay, so aestheticism in the 19th century became a kind of movement, and especially towards the end of the 19th century, a kind of cult of art and of artists. A cult of art and of artists. Now, remember, we talked a little bit about this when we were talking about Byron and the cult of the artist as somebody who was different from the rest of us, maybe even a rebel. The notion of the artist as bohemian, as it was called in the 19th century and early 20th century. That is to say, someone on the margins, someone who didn't fit in, someone who didn't play the same kinds of games that others do. That was part of a whole cult, not only of art, but of artists, often who distanced themselves from middle-class culture. And it was in terms of that kind of a cult that the terms like middle class and bourgeois became negative terms. Obviously not negative terms for everybody. I mean, lots of people are quite happy with being members of the middle class, but in being described as members of the middle class. But notice that at least in some circles, the terms middle class and the French word bourgeois, as brought over into English, became derogatory terms to suggest that the broad middle-class culture that developed in the 19th and 20th centuries was bland, uninteresting. What one cultural critic said of television a few years ago in a famous statement, it is a vast wasteland. Well, is that true or not? And if it's true, on what basis do you make that kind of claim? Well, aestheticism was a kind of cultivation of art which was elitist in its own way. Not elitist in terms of social classes necessarily, because we're not talking about people being from the aristocracy or the the landed gentry or something or other like that. But we're talking about a new kind of aristocracy, the aristocracy of art. The aristocracy of art, in which, the artist as aristocrat might wear shabby old clothes, might live in a poor section of town, might deliberately have an old rattle-trap car, or maybe no car at all, okay? And so on and so on and so on. So that the person didn't have to be, of some kind of elevated social or socio-economic class, but nevertheless would be regarded as special in terms of this kind of cult of aestheticism. And you find a lot of that in France among painters and the lionizing of painters in the 19th century. I mean, look at how we anglicized the name of Van Gogh as Van Gogh, right? Or Gauguin, and so forth. I mean, we lionize these people. Modigliani, selling off his paintings that are now considered great masterpieces for a few sous so that he can buy another bottle of cheap red wine, while his pregnant girlfriend is following after him down the rainy streets of Paris. Okay, well, okay. There was one famous work on Modigliani entitled Prince of Bohemians. Well, okay. Notice how in some respects that is a continuation of a certain form of the Byronic tradition. The Byronic hero is a kind of rebel. But notice what the rebel is rebelling against here. It's not necessarily the state. It's not necessarily some form of government. It's not necessarily even the economic system, though it could be these things. Some artists have also been political activists, but by no means all artists have been. And as a matter of fact, in this cult of aestheticism, people often argued that one deliberately should not be political, because the artist should be above such things. I mean, not all artists have been that way. I mean, look at the great Mexican painter Diego Rivera, who did all those wonderful, wonderful, wonderful frescoes, and how very, very politically committed he was to his causes. Or Picasso was very, very politically involved and very politically active, and so on. I mean, we obviously could talk about many, many more, but that is not part of the kind of cult of aestheticism that I'm talking about right now. Notice, secondly, if we can go back to the screen, I'm stressing here how for Pater and for people who follow in Pater's footsteps, there's a primacy of the sensation of beauty, not simply what is beauty in the abstract, philosophically considered, but if we look at something which is a beautiful painting, what are the sensations that are provoked in us by that? And that, once again, as in Ruskin, is something that's going to be very important to Pater. And notice this is a shift in emphasis from the object as object to the subjective experience of the object, which is something that we've talked a good deal about before in this class. And then, of course, finally, he's trying to arrive at a kind of aesthetic criticism. Now, this is going to be somewhat different from the cultural criticism of Ruskin in Stones of Venice. This is going to be an attempt to derive a kind of aesthetic criticism in which we have artistic grounds for making our distinctions. Okay, so this is our Pater. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself now. Well, let's look at the preface. And I'm beginning about, 7 or 8 lines down from the very beginning of the preface to the Renaissance. With the word beauty, the sentence beginning with the word beauty, like all other qualities presented to human experience, is relative. This is relative, like other qualities. Not quantities, but qualities, notice. And the definition of it becomes unmeaning and useless in proportion to its abstractness. See, just abstract definitions of beauty or of the beautiful don't get us anywhere. To define beauty, not in the most abstract, but in the most concrete terms possible, to find not its universal formula, but the formula which expresses most adequately this or that special manifestation of it, is the aim of the true student of aesthetics. Okay? What makes this poem beautiful, or what makes that painting beautiful? Not what is beauty with a capital B in the abstract, in some kind of Platonic sense. So what he wants, therefore, is to see the object as in itself it really is, which, as the footnote points out, is a quotation from Matthew Arnold. Has been justly said to be the aim of all true criticism whatever, and in aesthetic criticism, the first step toward seeing one object as it really is to know one's own impression, as it really is, to discriminate it, to realize it distinctly. In other words, as I look at the painting, I should be analyzing my own feelings. How do I feel about this painting? Why do I have the kinds of feelings I do about this painting? The objects with which aesthetic criticism deals, music, poetry, artistic and accomplished forms of human life, are indeed receptacles of so many powers or forces. They possess, like the products of nature, so many virtues or qualities. What is this song or picture, this engaging personality presented in life or in a book to me, not just to anybody, but to me? Notice I am analyzing my own psychology here. What effect does it really produce on me? Notice this is where he wants to begin. It's not where he's going to end necessarily, but that's where he wants to begin. Does it give me pleasure? And if so, what sort or degree of pleasure? How is my nature modified by its presence and under its influence? Okay? Now, of course, as he goes on, I'm skipping over a sentence there, and he who experiences these impressions strongly and drives directly at the discrimination and analysis of them has no need to trouble himself with the abstract question what beauty is in itself or what its exact relation to truth or experience. Metaphysical questions as unprofitable as metaphysical questions elsewhere. He may pass them all by as being answerable or not, of no interest to him. Now that is very interesting. That's the first time, well, it's not quite the first time. We saw, Huxley making the same kind of argument. Remember in the little bit that we looked at with Huxley talking about agnosticism, that we can be certain about certain kinds of things for which we have some kind of direct evidence. But we cannot be certain when we are dealing with metaphysical questions. physical, we all know what physical means, of course, but the Greek prefix meta means over or beyond. And what metaphysics usually means in philosophy is to try to investigate what reality lies beyond that which we see. Okay? As for Plato, for example, in some kind of transcendental world of ideal forms or of ideas, excuse me, such as the ideal form of beauty, which might be captured here in some physical object. But the idea or ideal of beauty for a Platonist would exist beyond the physical world in some kind of ideal world of forms, of perfect forms. Well, for Pater, that's simply an idle metaphysical question. We're not going to get anywhere with that, he says. But notice, he's not looking simply at the painting, he's looking at himself. Now, that's direct evidence too, isn't it? I mean, presumably you know what your own feelings are, or at least you can analyze your feelings. You can get better and better and better at analyzing your feelings, right? You're looking at a picture. What are you feeling? Okay, that is evidence, isn't it? But evidence of what? Well, let's look on. In the next paragraph, he says, the aesthetic critic, then, regards all the objects with which he has to do, all works of art, and the fairer forms of nature and human life, as powers or forces producing pleasurable sensations. In other words, there are powers in the work of art itself, which are capable of producing those sensations in us. So what we're doing is we're reasoning backwards from effect to cause. If I feel transported by looking at a particular painting, there must be something about that painting which is creating that response in me. Okay? And so he goes on, and let's see, towards the end of his next sentence, he's talking about the property each painting or book or whatever, has of affecting one with a special, a unique impression of pleasure. Our education, we were wondering perhaps when he was going to get around to that. Our education becomes complete in proportion as our susceptibility to these impressions increases in depth and variety. In other words, that's not just something that you're born with. This is something that you can become educated in. If you read enough good books, you're going to develop a sense of what a good book is. If you read nothing but trash, then you may never really be able to recognize a good book if you do encounter one. And the same thing would apply to paintings, to music, to, ballet, to opera, whatever it might be, okay? And I don't mean, just specialized forms or so-called elite arts, like opera. I'm talking about things like the blues. I mean, there are, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful examples of the blues, a popular art form. And then there's a lot of just imitative stuff that it's just really not worth very much. Okay? So he's talking then about how you also have to have a certain kind of education. Yes, temperament, but also education. The educational system, by the way, had been revised in Europe after the revolutionary activities of 1848. And in the German-speaking countries, one of the parts of the curriculum that was developed was what was called in German, of course, the Geisteswissenschaften, that is to say, the studies, or even the sciences, if you will, of the mind, the spirit, okay? Poetry and the arts and so forth would be among these. Philosophy would be too, by the way, and religion and so forth. Okay, so, and we've talked about this a lot here already, the preoccupation with education. How do you make progress, individually and collectively? Through education, right? But it has to be the right kind of education. People like Pater are suggesting, and of course Arnold. Okay, so jump to the next paragraph. What is important then is not that the critic should possess a correct abstract definition of beauty for the intellect, but a certain kind of temperament, the power of being deeply moved by the presence of beautiful objects. Okay? And then look at the end of that same paragraph. In whom did the stir, the genius, the sentiment of the period find itself? You're talking about the 18th century, or the Renaissance, or the Middle Ages. Where was the receptacle of its refinement, its elevation, its taste? And he cites Blake. And then he goes on in the next paragraph. Often it will require great nicety, that is to say, ability to distinguish and make distinctions, from the commoner elements with which it may be found in combination. Few artists, not Goethe or Byron even, work quite cleanly, casting off all debris and leaving us only what the heat of their imagination is wholly fused and transformed. Okay? As the Roman poet and critic Horace had one time said, sometimes even Homer nods. And he goes on to say, by the way, that Christian art of the Middle Ages has gotten a bad reputation, and that's too bad. That's too bad. You know, because actually all of those things that we associate with the Renaissance and the great cultural renewal of the Renaissance, you can find beginning way back in the Middle Ages. And he said, I can show you lots of examples of that. Again, we've got a revaluation of the Middle Ages. And then we have a very, very famous passage. Let's go to the conclusion. The conclusion. And in our textbook, skip the long first paragraph and then skip the long second paragraph down to the third paragraph in the conclusion. The one that begins with the German word philosophieren. And go to the third sentence, the one that begins every moment. Every moment some form grows perfect in hand or face. Some tone on the hills or the sea is choicer than the rest. Some mood of passion or insight or intellectual excitement is irresistibly real and attractive to us, for that moment only. Not the fruit of experience, but experience itself is the end. A counted number of pulses only is given to us of a variegated dramatic life. How may we see in them all that is to be seen in them by the finest senses? How shall we pass most swiftly from point to point and be present always at the focus where the greatest number of vital forces unite in their purest energy? To burn always, and this is a very famous line, by the way, to burn always with this hard, gem-like flame is to maintain this ecstasy, is success in life. And he's talking about experiencing this in art. In art. How can we have the greatest number of these intense moments of experience? Well, for him, it is to seek out the greatness that we can find in art or in nature, for that matter. Notice he keeps saying that over and over again. That in some sense, nature is art too. And we respond to the beauty in nature And we also respond to the beauty in great works of art. And one of the reasons why we not only seek out great works of art, but we return to great works of art as we return to nature as an inexhaustible supply of this kind of peak experience, is because that life is lived most fully, at least according to Pater, which is a life in which one burns always with this hard gem-like flame, maintaining some kind of ecstasy. Well, interesting. Okay, well, we're going to take a break, and then we're going to come back and talk a little further about this.